Are 35% of people responding to your cold sales emails? If not, then this episode is for you. Hello, Sales Nation, and welcome to today's episode of the Salesman podcast. On today's show, we have Heather Morgan. She's a cold email expert, and you can find out more about her over at salesfolk.com. On today's show, we're deciphering how to know whether your cold emails suck or whether they're performing well, how you can send better performing sales emails, and how just generally you can get your customers and prospects to give a shit about what you're sending them and get a response. Everything that we talk about is available in the show notes of this podcast over at salesmanpodcast.com. And with all that said, let's jump into today's episode. Heather, welcome to the Salesman podcast.
Thanks for having me.
You're more than welcome. Glad to have you on. I'm glad to dive into email. I think you being so specialist in this are going to give us some real interesting insights and perhaps go deeper than other guests that we've had on to talk about this. But to frame up the conversation and to give us some insights as to whether we need to work on our sales emails or not, how do we know whether our emails are awesome or whether they, for want of a better word, whether they suck?
Well, I mean, there's the qualitative way and the quantitative way to do it. I'm a former economist, so I like numbers. I would say a good response rate, which is ultimately the thing that you're aiming for. So a good positive response rate would be somewhere between 10 to 35%. That said, that number ranges as much as it does because if you're reaching out to like CIOs, they're going to be a lot harder to get a hold of than VP sales or VP marketing. So when I say 10 to 35%, if you're on like the 10% side, that should really only be more so if you're reaching out to really difficult people, usually more so technical people. But don't say, oh, I'm great because I have 30% necessarily, because you can get higher than that. It's just that you have to think about the audience, also product market fit and list quality. And so if your numbers are hovering in the low single digit percentage, your emails might suck, or you might just have a really bad list. So you shouldn't necessarily automatically think my numbers suck my emails suck if my numbers suck, but there's a good chance that they do. Qualitatively, though, if you're getting a bunch of nasty responses to the cold emails or sales prospecting emails you send, that's a good indicator. I mean, there'll always be trolls and jerks out there who just hate cold email, hate sales, hate whatever, not your fault. Maybe they're having a bad day. But at the same time, our salespeople and a lot of our clients, one of the things they tell us is even when people reject them, they do it in such a polite way most of the time. So that's a good sign because, I mean, maybe we're just getting lucky, but I think it's more than that. I think it's that the emails we're sending have a thoughtful, respectful tone. So even when people are not interested, they politely and respectfully decline rather than saying like, F you, don't ever, blah, 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 like some people actually do have to deal with. And as a salesperson, it's not easy. I mean, rejection's never easy, but it's nice when they're not like wanting to like throw a coffee mug at you.
So this is something I wanted to ask about a bit further on down the conversation, but I'll ask it now. Should we always be aiming for an email that gets, how to describe, almost like a lukewarm, pleasant response? Or should we be more, again, aggressive perhaps isn't the best word, but perhaps push the boundaries a little bit more and accept a few emails of people calling us idiots for the sake of the response, the positive responses are more positive, if that makes sense? Should we be careful or should we be willing to push the boundaries as we're sending emails?
So that's a great question. So I'm actually kind of a wild card risk taker. I lived in post-revolutionary Egypt after Arab Spring. So I'm all for taking risks, but I think that it's not about, there's a difference between taking risks and there's a difference between being a jackass who doesn't think about other people. And so like, if you want to try something new and crazy, I say go for it. Try it with an email, see what happens, but do think about who your audience is. If you're emailing 65-year-old banking professionals, probably, that crazy wildcard stuff probably isn't going to go as well as if you're dealing with like 27-year-old millennials in tech or whatever. But that said, it's okay to take risks, but like you have to think, what is that risk or edgy thing, and why do you think it's going to work, and why do you want to try it? And so maybe, sometimes we just have like a gut feeling and we want to try something crazy, and you never know. Sometimes it will work. But I think a lot of times salespeople will go for like more like aggressive or like for selfish reasons, I guess. I mean, you're a salesperson. You want to get responses, you want to close deals, you want to drive results. But when you're trying something out of like desperation, it shows, and people can smell that. So it shouldn't be like, oh, respond to me, or like some stupid thing where you feel like, or the person feels like you're holding them hostage. You don't want that. And it's not just because of the negative responses. It's okay, maybe you have a thick skin, maybe you like abuse. It's also about your spam score and people marking you as spam. And so if you're a jerk, you're much more likely to have them marking you as spam. And I would say you don't necessarily actually even have to go for like the yes. When we're writing our emails, we're not thinking, oh, how can we get like this polite response? That's not what we want. We obviously would love it if they're a great fit to be a customer for us or our customers, and they say, hey, yeah, like let's talk. But at the same time, the second best option is for them to say, we're not a fit, so that you're not wasting time with them. And so I think if you do that in a thoughtful way, and this isn't like an email full of like delightful pleasantries and like bullshit, it's a straightforward, honest email that's thoughtful and hopefully tries to add some value. But sometimes it's not about adding value. Sometimes it's like making them feel kind of uncomfortable and hitting on a really kind of, pain point that makes them feel a bit uneasy. But like something like that, I would say try using fear, honestly, but not the kind of fear that's like empty or like you're gonna get hacked tomorrow if you don't, that's ransomware or pretty close to it. But bringing up the uncomfortable questions, I think, does tend to work pretty well. And uncomfortable topics, you just have to do it in the right way, so that
what would be an example of an email that is a salesperson being an aggressive arsehole, clearly the stereotype of salesperson that we're trying to move away from? What would be an example of that? And then what would be, conversely, an email that is persuasive, brings up a fear or a doubt or whatever it is, and pulls on someone's emotions? What's an example of both of those?
So I don't have anything in front of me right now to share an exact example, but I think the emails that are just generally narcissistic and they're like, hey, I'm following up with you for the 5th time. Why aren't you responding? Whatever. Like, okay, I don't give a shit that you emailed me 5 times. I'm not interested. You're not adding value. You're not relevant to me. Stop spamming me. So that's sort of like on one hand. Obviously, there's other things that people say and do in their emails that can be even worse than that. That are sometimes very obnoxious. A lot of times that's when you are accusing the person of something. Even if there is a problem in their company, it's better for you to talk about the situation in a like more open potential form. Like maybe even referencing an anecdote of like, hey, like I was just talking to this VP sales and they told me they're having a problem with da 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 da. Have you ever like dealt with anything like that at company? Or like, we help them solve it by da 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 da. Can we share some of the lessons that we learned from working with so and so? So, that is just one example I kind of threw out there, but you need to think, and there's a gazillion ways to write a good email, and that's why I think most people don't do it well, because they want like this magic template. And the truth is, if there's a magic template, even if it works now, it's not going to work much longer, because everyone's going to use it and hit it hard.
Well, I think we've all had, as an example of that, we've all had that Aaron Ross templated email of, hi, are you the best person to speak to about XYZ? If not, can you pass me on to the person who's the right person to speak to about one, two, three?
So I actually collaborated with Aaron on the sequel of his book, and that email you mentioned in particular, Aaron got from someone else that someone got from someone else probably more than 20 years ago.
Wow.
So, okay, 20 plus years ago, no LinkedIn, no Twitter, online experience, social media, all these different like companies that are being reviewed on G2 Crowd, whatever, TechCrunch, they're not there. They don't exist. So you have to realize that email template was written when we were very much living in the dark. Obviously, there was the internet, but the visibility of the customer and the salesperson were completely different. And so now you're living in a world where we have so much more visibility on both sides, and that template looks really, really lazy. There are a few situations where you can ask, you don't have to say, are you the right person? But like, I'm looking for the person that manages da 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 because, and that shouldn't be the person who manages sales at company, but like video production for blah, blah, blah ad campaigns. And it's never a specific title over and over. So like in that scenario, it's appropriate to ask or bring up something like that. But to use that as a default, that thing is really outdated and it's really worn out because it's basically like a lazy salesperson sending it.
Well, I've got an even better example than that of I get emails all the time from the audience and I've got no budget to spend, so I don't know why people cold emailing me anyway. But one that I get at least once a week is a template that if you search for sales email templates or something like that, a HubSpot blog post comes up and it's the top template on that blog post.
Oh my God, I think I know. So to bring up the Aaron thing again. So when I collaborated with Aaron and Jason Limpkin like 3 years ago, I helped do a bunch of editing in the sequel to their book, but there was a section on cold email that I wrote and Aaron had asked, Heather, can we have a template? And so we had a template that was very successful for one of our clients that our client was no longer using. And so I asked them if it was okay if we included it. They said yes. And the reason why I picked that particular template was because it was very specific to our client and what they were selling, and I knew it really wouldn't work for anyone else. And so what happened was it got in the book, and then as a way to drive leads and basically like excitement around the book, Aaron released parts of the book in different blog posts. And one of the things he released was that email template with my excerpt. I didn't know about it at the time, but obviously I was credited for it, whatever. And next thing I know, that template, before the book is even out, because it was on HubSpot, starts showing up everywhere. Starts showing up in my inbox, copy pasted, word for word, and people complaining saying, the template that you said got 16 customers doesn't work. And like they're selling insurance. And this is for like a sales acceleration tool. So people like to try and copy paste these things that aren't meant for them. And the reason the best ones work in the first place is they're super specific. So like in theory, if our client's competitor had used it initially, might have worked quite well. But the reality was it became like the internet spam template. And that's partly why I don't like to release good email templates anymore.
That's amazing. And it's probably
it might be
I'm blaming
one.
you, Heather, for the spam that I get every week. But narrowing this down slightly then, is there it seems like a daft question to ask, and I think I know the answer to it, but is there a magic bullet email template that, you know, clearly you and your team can create templates and content that do well, and I imagine there's a lot of data and back and forth that's involved in that. But for someone listening to the show now, is there a template that they can use in the industry in a specific vertical over and over and over and over? Or should they be customizing each and every email that they send? Because obviously there's a debate here of how much research you should do versus if you send 500 emails, will you get more responses from them? How does it all balance out?
So I would say definitely there's no magic bullet template out there. And like I said, if there is, it will be dead by the time you know about it. I actually wrote an article about this, about the HubSpot thing. But that said, you can write mass emails with very little personalization that do get 80% of the responses you would from a one-off email. And the key to doing that is never using like a template. You can create a template that does that, but the way to create it is to first think about who your audience is and research them. And there are a lot of things you can do with that. I call it e-stalking, and I like to take a sample size of about a dozen people from the list that you'll be targeting and just parse the crap out of their profiles on like LinkedIn, Twitter, job forums, anything and everything. Not just like keywords, but like try to take in, and maybe this is easier said than done for like a writer, but try to take in their writing and like what kind of person they are from their writing. But obviously, if you know someone in this persona, that can help you try to visualize them too. But what you want to do is you want it to feel like you're writing a message to a new friend that you met at a conference or a business dinner or whatever, and kind of assume that familiarity. Not like to the point it seems like fake and disingenuine, but to the point where like it's much better for, from the standpoint of human psychology, for you to sound like you know someone to get them to keep reading versus you to sound like, hey, like, I'm a traveling salesman. I'm knocking on your door in an email. So with that.
And how do we do that? Because it's one thing to say it, and clearly you're crazy knowledgeable in this, and I've got some kind of copywriting experience, so I think I can obviously not to your level, but I think I can deal a little bit with the idea of personas and marketing personas. But for the B2B salesperson who's listening, perhaps they've never even thought of a persona. Perhaps they're dealing with individuals all the time, but they want to either move into an SDR role where you've got to group together individuals, or perhaps it's an SDR who wants to up their game so they can move to an AE position. What is a persona? I want to dumb it down as simple as we can get here. What is a persona, and what are the traits or language, or how do we write to them?
So I'll give you a high level because I could go on for an hour just about this. But so in my mind, the persona I'm talking about isn't like the bullshit marketing Mary buyer persona. That's stupid. And honestly, a lot of those are borderline sexist, but that's a whole other thing. The persona that I think about and care about is basically the same as the criteria you would use to build your list or to qualify and disqualify. And so, ideally you have title in there. Sometimes you can group a few titles together, like maybe you can sell to VP marketing and CMO, and they have basically the same needs and pain points around your product or solution. So you can group them together. So it's like CMO/VP marketing, but other times you can't. And those are two different personas. Next, you should think about most likely company size. So kind of a good thinking experiment is to think, okay, like, say it's CMO, would a CMO at a 50-person company feel about this the same way as a 500-person or 1,000-person? And those are some numbers I threw out. You can change them to think about where that sort of splits. But you should think about, how those needs differ and where they start to like majorly diverge. And it'll be different for every kind of solution that you're selling, because the solution you're selling is solving pain points that are unique to that person or those people. And so company size sometimes isn't an issue at all, and you don't even need to think about it. Like any company size, same thing for this title. Other times, very important. Same thing kind of goes for industry. And sometimes you need to do a different like buyer persona for every different industry. Other times, doesn't matter. Kind of depends what you're selling again, and how they view it. And so the buyer persona is basically just like the criteria you would use to build a list to send a mail merge out to. And so whatever criteria you would use, whether it's those things, maybe you have like what technology they're using or other additional things like location, whatever, that's what your persona should be. And then to like create the persona that I talked about, just simply take like a random sample of like a dozen people from that list that you're going to send from anyways. And another way to do it is take that same criteria, try doing a LinkedIn search and see with that criteria and your random sampling if those people are similar. If they're not similar, then your persona needs to get smaller. So like if it's sort of like guess and check method. Like, if you didn't know how to do the math problem, you're guessing and checking. So it's really easy if you think something is the case to just take some samples and see like, oh yeah, these people are all kind of similar. Like, no, they're totally different. But as we're looking at the profiles, it's really great to have like a Google Doc or something like that open and just take a ton of notes. Things that stick out of you. Try to think of like KPIs, like key performance indicators, pain points, keywords that come up over and over. But really great place to look on LinkedIn are the recommendations they gave and received, because that shows you what kind of people they really are and what they care about and how people see them.
This is amazing. I don't know if everyone in the audience and yourself have played this game called Guess Who, where you have...
Oh, yeah, totally like Guess Who.
It almost seems like that. So how far...
That was my favorite game as a kid.
Yeah, I used to play it as a kid as well. So how far down this... Because this is seemingly a rabbit hole that could never end. How far down it do we need to go? Because what you've described there, the professional needs and wants. Do we need to go down... and I guess this is the difference between sales and marketing, is perhaps we can go further down the rabbit hole than what marketers can. Do we need to go further down the rabbit hole of doing this LinkedIn search? We discover that they're all white males who are 50, who are all VP of sales, rightly or wrongly. That's another conversation for itself. But that perhaps affects the language that we would use to talk to them. Or perhaps they're all Silicon Valley hipsters, and so perhaps we can start sending them different types of messaging. Do we need to go that far down the pathway here, or should we stick to the higher level professional traits that they've all got in common?
I mean, it depends, and the real answer is it will vary depending on what you're selling, who you're selling to. I usually typically wouldn't go like down to a gender stereotyped kind of role, but one thing that you can do is, at least for the campaign, once you have like what I consider the basics, like title, company size, industry, and like I said, even those are a little bit variable time to time. Once you have that, you can build a list of like 200 to 400 contacts or leads. And then once you've done your research, you can create your email campaign. I recommend 8 touches. You can write multiple variants if you want to test different things. But one of the cool things about cold email is it's so honest, because these aren't intros, these aren't referrals, these aren't customers. So people are completely honest. They either like you or they don't. They either respond positively or negatively, or they don't. And so with that in mind, what you can do is when you look at the results, you don't just want to look at like, hey, which email templates perform best, which have the best response rate, whatever. You also want to look at who responded and who responded to what. And sometimes you will see a cluster around a certain message. And so like maybe email 3A is this winning email, this sequence that got the most response rates by far. But email 5B got all the people from Idaho to respond, or, whatever industry or whatever thing. So you kind of want to like look back and forth and reverse engineer the people who responded too. And especially as salespeople, after you get the response, you're talking to them on the phone. You get to follow them throughout the sales journey, and you get to understand why they responded, who they are. And so you have a luxury that marketing rarely has, because you get additional level and layer of feedback that at best they can see usually like, oh, did you download a white paper? Did they attend a webinar? You get to talk to them. And so as you're doing that, you're kind of like almost like a scientist or an anthropologist, where you're thinking, okay, like oh, all these people, I'm noticing a trend here. What can I triple down on? If I target people with the same exact criteria, can I do a campaign that just focuses on this value prop that we got really great results on? And instead of making email 5, I'm making it email 1. And so that's where our email campaigns tend to get like 10 times better positive response rate than what people are already doing. But once you start to like really dive deeper into things like that, you get even bigger lift, because not only are you improving response rate, you're finding a whole niche to triple down on. And that's when you can really have even more success.
Love it. So we should have somewhat of a hypothesis, which is built up on the data that we've collected, and then try and prove or disprove that hypothesis. I like this. We talked about this similarly on the show in the past, but never email by email, and then perhaps you swap the emails round. Perhaps you bin one off and only have 7, and that's more effective than all 8. And on that, Heather, we could probably spend 4 hours diving into the intricacies of each email, but roughly, what do those 8 emails look like? Because as you say that, if someone sent me 8 emails and I didn't respond to any of them, I'd be starting to get, unless they were your emails and they're clearly skillfully put together, but if the average salesperson sent me 8 emails, I'd be starting to get annoyed by the end of it.
They're never the same. That's kind of the beauty of what we do. Like, it's funny, one of my sales guys likes to say we're like artisans, and like that's a little silly, but like we're really thinking about this carefully for every client. And so we kind of are. So we have a few underlying principles with how we work, and they're actually based on statistics and game theory, but one of them is maximize variance. So what does that mean in layman's terms? That means make your emails as different as possible, while obviously having them be relevant to your audience and what you're selling, but make them as different as possible. This helps avoid the redundancy, but this also helps you rapidly optimize, because the things you're testing, if you imagine like a piece of paper, a lot of times when people A/B test, they do it so horribly wrong. They'll focus on this like narrow little piece, the size of like a pencil eraser head. And I was talking to someone on a call the other day about this, a sales leader, and they're telling me they're doing A/B testing. I'm like, that's great. And then I asked them what they were doing, and they were not systematic about it, and they were testing silly little things that are so narrow. Once you've gotten your messaging down, you can obsess with silly little things. But if you have a whole space to cover, it's not worth it. It's better to cover as much ground as you can and start to kind of see like where you're cold or warm, and like, oh, warm, let's see if we can get hotter. So there are a lot of ways we can break that down, but we tend to think about like value props or benefits, pain points, or kind of like a third wildcard category, which is a bit more creative and out there. And a lot of times the more creative out there ones are the best, but some of our clients aren't comfortable with those. So
how do you break through that then, Heather? Sorry to interrupt you there, but that's something that, so the guys over at Lead IQ, Ryan and Cole, they always send me incredible emails. They always get responses from me whenever they're asking for something. They sponsored the show, and that was set up from an amazing email from them that was like funny animations and GIFs. And I spoke to them about this phenomenon of, for me as a sales professional in medical device sales, for working for a really prestigious medical device company, family-owned, multi-billion-dollar company, if I was to send a surgeon one of these animations,
it would not be appropriate at all.
That's just it.
Well,
it might be appropriate.
Sometimes.
Yeah, because some of the registrars who I would be dealing with, who would get me in front of the surgeons, they're my age, so they get it. So perhaps I wouldn't send, a hilarious animation to a 70-year-old surgeon who's like 2 weeks away from retiring. Perhaps that wouldn't be appropriate. But where I was going with that was, even if it was effective, my sales manager would probably be trying to stop me doing it. So how do we negate this? Is it a case of you should do it and ask for forgiveness rather than permission? And, me and you are probably on the same lines of this, using your term as a kind of like putting wild cards in there to experiment. But is that how we should be looking at it from the get-go, that there should always be an element of randomness involved so that we can find out if something crazy is going to work?
I'm a fan of testing and trying some crazy shit, but you actually, with in particular like GIFs and embedded videos and images, you actually really need to be careful as far as like having them not just go to spam, and like thinking about the text image ratio. And also, if your email itself is completely based around that image, what happens if it doesn't show up? You need to be prepared for that in your email copy. So we actually don't do like any GIFs or anything in our clients' emails. A few of our clients might send them out, but we don't do that for various reasons. But there are a lot of things you can do with writing, with metaphors, with anecdotes, with weird subject lines that have the same effect. And I think like I personally do like some really stupid, funny GIFs. But not everyone does. And also, like, the email deliverability factor is problematic, especially if you're talking about emailing the enterprise. So we don't really do that. But ultimately, I think people don't realize how creative they can be with just words in like 3 or 4 sentences. And so think about your audience. What's funny to you isn't necessarily funny or appropriate to them. But like weird things, especially if you can think about things that are something that relates to their daily life. So there's a book, I think it's called Made to Stick by Chip Heath, I believe, that I read many years ago. And there's other books like this, but basically the idea is behind a lot of great marketing, writing, propaganda, what have you, are the ideas that are already in someone's head. So instead of like just going with like absurd, stupid things, if you can kind of look like an email that they already need to read and jump onto that with or without humor, without making them feel like you misled them and tricked them, but like having it be just on the borderline between like, oh, like, that's my fault, I mistook it. You want the reader to almost think that like, oh, like that's my accident, or not even thinking about that, because you have in a split fraction of a second, you have them interested to open, you have them reading, you have them hooked to respond. So it's happening so fast that they're not even thinking about if they do it right. But if they think twice, you want them to almost think like, oh, like, you know, that was ambiguous, but it didn't seem like, you know, you wouldn't say like, your wife is in the trunk of my car. Yeah, you're gonna open that email, but it's not gonna end well relationship wise between the customer and you.
So are we looking for so I've read loads of books on joke writing. It's something that really interests me. Whether people find me funny or not is another kind of question altogether. But are we looking for this? We give like an empathetic statement and then we twist it on its head, but it's relatable to them. So say like we're dealing with a VP of sales. That's the first thing that comes to mind. Are we giving them a scenario that's comfortable and then turn it on its head so there's some humor to it, and that is super targeted towards them? Is that the content that we're looking for versus what would clearly not work, which is just sending them a random business joke and expecting a response?
Yeah, it's more toward the first, but I mean, honestly, there's dozens of different tactics and approaches you can try, and it really depends.
Heather, what's the easiest?
Yeah.
Just so the audience listening to the show now, so that they're probably driving on the way to the office, or they're just about to sit down after having the breakfast to write some sales emails. What is the easiest and most kind of biggest leverage structure of an email that is the hardest to screw up? Because clearly the solution is to kind of get in touch with yourself, or, you know, get involved with the courses that you've got on your website, which we'll touch on in a second. But what's the one email that you would give to someone that is hard to screw up, that is better than, hi, can you tell me who the right person to speak to is?
Okay, so that's hard because I don't think like a normal person. So what's easy to me is hard to other people and vice versa. But let me think based on that. I mean, I think one sort of simple go-to approach, you can always try to like interview someone or do market research with them. That's sort of like an easy one. The problem with that email approach is that people who respond might not be qualified leads. So if you do that, you need to do that for a really targeted list. You also need to have like a plan. So if you say you're going to interview someone, okay, are you writing an article or what? Like, are you getting a quote from them? What are you doing? The other thing about that it won't work with everyone, but there's a certain percentage of people that are either looking for publicity or like helping people or whatever that will always respond to that email. So that's kind of like a easy little trick. But I wouldn't say, like with anything, to just only rely on that, because it's going to get you maybe like 5 to 10% of the people that are going to respond, maybe more sometimes. But not everyone. But the thing I want to add, if you're going to use that, you need to add value. So it's not just like, I want you to like tell me about da 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 da. You need to also try to say what they're going to get. Like, in exchange for your time, I'm going to share X tips that help get XYZ result for client X. And so I made that one up, but something like that, so that you're offering value to them. And even better, if you're trying to do the market research or interview thing, you mention other people that you have talked to for social proof. So the higher up, the better. And maybe even you can mention your customers, or your company's partners, something like that. But yeah, so I mean, that's an easy one, but honestly, like, the best things are never the easiest. That's just the reality of life.
Love it. You've summed up there something that I have talked about on the show before, and it's something that I would have done. I'm going to mash up two conversations here, both email outreach and content. But something that I would have done, in the fact that I only had, say, 40 to 50 urologists that I was selling to when I was in medical devices, I would have started some kind of, in hindsight, and I'm confident that if I would have told myself to do this 3 years ago, I'd still would have been an idiot and been lazy and not done it. But I think it would have been a good idea to put together some really niche. So I live in Leeds up here in the UK, in Yorkshire. I would have put together a real niche email newsletter and interviewed all these surgeons. And then clearly they're all battling over their egos. They're all battling over which is the best way to do things. It would add value to them because it would give other insights that perhaps they wouldn't ask another surgeon, because they don't want to look weak, or they don't want to look like they're taking advice from someone that they're essentially competing with. But they would lap it up in a monthly email or something like that. And it gives you a foot in the door. It gives you 20 minutes to interview them in person. And so we've talked about it on the podcast before, but I don't think every salesperson needs to create content. But that would be something that I think would be really useful, that I could, use your email technique to get in the door and then create content that allows me to get in the door of other people as well, right?
Totally. No, we did that. We did that in the early days, actually. And like, it's funny because I sort of stumbled into sales folk. The quick backstory is I've always been sending cold emails. I've always been getting results, but I didn't even know that cold email was a thing. And that's what salespeople and biz dev people did for a living. Or there's cold calling too. But anyways, so what happened was, when I started the company, I didn't actually know much about sales because I'd been doing biz dev previously in a job, and before that I was an economist. So what happened that I did that actually helped me learn a lot about sales and land new business was I went around interviewing all these people like Mark Rivera's from HubSpot and all these different sales leaders, and I got to build my network really fast. I got to know them, and a bunch of these interviews actually led to business, either with that company directly or with, another company that they knew. And so really effective. It definitely takes a lot of work. And the thing that I mentioned that happened to me was that it's really easy to get people to respond and say yes to interviews. So you need to be careful so that you don't end up having, unless you want to, a full-time job creating interview content, because that's not necessarily closing deals.
For sure. There's a balance there. Interestingly, I do this on the show. If I want someone from LinkedIn to kind of do business with us and work with us or sponsor the show, I just invite the highest people up in LinkedIn that I can get on the podcast. And it's a great foot in the door, because who doesn't want their ego stroked? Who doesn't want that value up front? And Heather, I can see 500 podcasts being sprung up in tiny niches in different spaces as people listen to the show, as the 20,000 people download it. So Genuinely, there might be, I say 500, there might be a couple of podcasts or a couple of interviews or a couple of blogs that pop out of this. And I think it's not right for everyone, but I think it'd be useful for some people. And with that, Heather, to wrap up the show, I've got one question here that I ask everyone that comes on. And that is, if you could go back in time and speak to your younger self, what would be the one piece of advice you'd give her to help her become better at selling?
One that comes to mind is, I guess, disqualify more early on. And part of that is not just like qual criteria, but like making sure that they really have a pain. Because I think earlier on, I definitely would have conversations and people would ask for a proposal and I would send it. And then, you wonder, oh, where did that deal go? They're not responding. But if you probe deeper earlier on, not just like assume that they have a need, but like really probe deep into that, I think a lot of times you find what you can use to move the deal forward, or like, hey, we actually shouldn't be talking right now, and I'm not gonna send a proposal, but when you do need let's talk. And people do appreciate that honesty too.
Good stuff. I appreciate that. It's something I started with the podcast of trying to close every single advertising deal we possibly could. Now we're constantly oversubscribed, and the people who want to sponsor, not that there's a waiting list, but I get to pick and choose people, which is fantastic. And so I'm refining this disqualification skill as I go along. And I remember this is like 12 months ago when we started getting more people wanting to sponsor. Obviously, we only do so many episodes, so we can only fit so many people on. But it was really painful for me at first to say no to people, and it's just a sign that anyone who's listening who's in this scenario, your prices need to go up. You need to choose the correct people to go with that are going to be better customers over the long term, that are going to be less of a pain in the arse and going to be a long-term customer versus someone who's just in it for the short term. And so there's probably a whole podcast to dive into there between both of our experiences with that, Heather. But with that, tell us a little bit more about SalesFolk, where we can find out more about you, and then for anyone who's intrigued and wants to learn more about the courses as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So salesfolk.com, folk, F-O-L-K, not fork, not any other thing, salesfolk.com. And you can actually reach out to me directly if you want at HRM, like Heather Rayhan Morgan, at salesfolk.com. You can also reach out to me on Twitter at Heather Rayhan, R-E-Y-H-A-N. It's my middle name. And then also I'm on LinkedIn. If you just search Heather R. Morgan, you can connect with me there. And I also do have 2 columns. One is with Inc. magazine, and the other is with Forbes. So if you search Heather R. Morgan on Inc. or Forbes, you should be able to find my column. My Inc. column is called Influence Talks. I don't remember what my Forbes column is called, but it's there. And then as far as the course goes, so we have a ton of free resources on the SalesFolk blog. We have our Hall of Shame, where we critique bad cold emails that the audience sends in. You can send them to us as well at shame@salesfolk.com. Feel free to nominate a bad cold email for an award. But also, we have a lot of very positive, very helpful free guides, tips. And then there's the Cold Email Mastery course, which is also on the website. And we basically have, as of right now, the first lesson is free for you to check out and try. And then there are dozens of lessons and recorded webinars and cool things like that. Everything that we've talked about, but even more in depth.
Love it. Well, I'll put all of that in the show notes of this episode over at salesmanpodcast.com. And with that, Heather, I want to thank you for your time, your insights on this, and I want to thank you for joining us on the Salesman Podcast.
Thanks for having me. Happy cold emailing.